Hey everyone, Pete Calandra here. Today's video is an excerpt from one of my college classes. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at Jerry Goldsmith's opening theme to Poltergeist. And I find this to be a really interesting take on scary music for a horror film. Anyway, as this film contains copywritten material, it's most likely going to be demonetized, so you could greatly help me out if you like this video by subscribing, leaving comments down below, and also buying me a cup of coffee. There's a link for that in the description box below. There's also a link for the study guides to this class in the description box below. Anyway, I've been Pete Calandra. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.
Okay, let's watch the beginning of this. Let's just talk about this. So the 1982, Spielberg kind of was under contract for something, and he wasn't supposed to be able to direct any film. So he wrote the script to this film, and he sort of ghost directed it. Somebody else got credit for directing it, and he got credit for writing the script and producing the film. And it was this horror film called Poltergeist, which was a huge success. And the basic story, I've got this written out of this. So the story follows the Freeling family who live in a quiet Southern California suburb until strange occurrences begin to plague their home. Objects move on their own, eerie voices come from the television, and a terrifying storm culminates in their youngest daughter, Carol Ann, being mysteriously pulled into a ghostly dimension through the TV. Paranormal investigators and spiritual medium try to rescue her. The family learns that their house was built on a former cemetery, and the spirits buried beneath are seeking revenge. The film blends domestic normalcy with escalating supernatural terror, becoming a landmark of 1980s horror for its emotional core, visual effects, and the chilling line, "They're here." So basically, they were living like in a development, right? That was built on a former cemetery, and everybody was told that all the cemetery things were moved to another and buried in another spot, but they only took the headstones and left all the graves and the remains underneath. And what's really interesting about the film, like when you see some horror films, like it's blood and gore right from the beginning, right? But what's interesting about this film is that, like, you know, it's like you're in this suburban, peaceful, well-kept, well-to-do suburb area, all new houses, families, kids playing on bicycle in the streets. There's not a lot of traffic. It's sort of like, you know, kind of like what some people consider to be like the American dream at that time. And, you know, there's like all sorts of like scenes of innocence, children playing, the parents playing with the kids, and things like that. And then things get stranger and stranger and stranger, leading to these incredibly horrific confrontations at the end. And everybody sort of, I'm not going to give away the ending in case you ever want to watch it, but it gets really, really intense. And what makes it, the intense stuff, so much more compelling is the way that it's set up with all these peaceful scenes of normalcy and like the innocence of youth, right? With all these kids just playing and nobody knows what kind of horrors are awaiting just a short time in the future. So let's watch the opening credits. Okay, so you wouldn't think a film that starts off like that would be a horror film, but it is, right? So let's take a look at that. So the thing is that there is very atonal, dissonant, scary music later on, but it's made more effective by being set up by this peaceful, almost like you're watching a Hallmark Christmas movie or something like that. All you need is some sleigh bells, and maybe it's set up in New Hampshire or something like that, and it would be like a Hallmark movie, right? Okay, so let's take a listen. Let's see. Just setting this up. All right, so we're going to listen to the opening, the full opening of the film right now, and it starts off with another piece called "The Light," and then it segues into Carol Ann's theme. And this transcription is not the exact arrangement that we have here, but you'll be able to you'll get the gist from it. Okay, let's take a listen. I'll let you know when this comes in, or you'll be able to hear it. He's almost playing around with it. Let me just stop that for a second. That's sort of what that little prelude there, and anybody know what mode that is? Thank you, Daniel. Lydian. So what's different with a Lydian to a major scale or a major scale, let's say? Sharp 4. Good. And you hear in a lot of flat 7 would be Dorian, would be mixing flat 6. So Dorian would be all the white keys from D, right? So flat 3 and flat 7 would be Dorian. In F it would be that. Okay, so you'll hear Lydian used in a lot of film music. I use it all the time. It's an interesting way to wonder, little mystical, magical, right? Right. Right, those kinds of sounds, or things like that. Okay, so that he gives you a little taste of what's coming here with that. So let's go back and listen. That was the Lydian there at the end. Right, that's a little otherworldly there in a very subtle way, preparing you. Now we're into the theme here. The little girl's name is Carol Ann. Lydian right there. Now we're up in A flat from F, so chromatic mediant modulation. And then it goes back into this section here. See how we changed the orchestration the second time through here? Yeah, we're back in F now. Okay, so there's a couple of ways to look at the structure of this, right? One is that it's got an A section, and then it's got a B section, and then there's like a little sort of a little subsection right here, and then it goes back to the A section, right? That's one way of looking at it, but you can also think of it as ABA, meaning that the A section is the opening bit in the key of F. The B section is when that repeats in the key of A flat, and the A section is when it returns back to F for the end, right? So that's like the big picture structure of it. So a couple of things here, right? He's got this left hand. Right? And so that's like just a typical kind of eighth note rolling figure that you'd hear in like the music of John Field, or, you know, it's a simpler thing than what Chopin would do, but similar ideas. You could have those kinds of accompaniments, and they are a takeoff on what kind of, does anybody have an idea as to what the antecedent to this kind of a rolling figure in the left hand was? What left hand pattern in music preceded this kind of a figure? Right? Anybody know what that kind of a bass line is called in classical music? Thank you. Alberti bass, right? An eighth note figure that just repeats. Here, what happens when they expand it here, it gives you the opportunity for it to become more lyrical and to imbue it with some really interesting counterlines. So, for example, so if we look at this measure here, we have right? We have that inside there so that when you're orchestrating this, right, you certainly could have a harp going. Right? But you can have another instrument at bringing those lines out, like a clarinet, ba da da, ba da da, ba da da, right? You know, whatever it is, you could bring it out by having another instrument playing that. And in fact, if we listen to this, let's see. Now listen to the strings coming in. Right? And it's a harmony line to what's written there already. So it just, you know, it gives you a lot of opportunities to expand your orchestration from this. And, you know, one of the, when I took my first orchestration class when I was a senior in undergraduate school, we used to have to do piano reductions of string quartets, right? And one of the things to do is to figure out how to translate orchestral, you know, sounds into what is appropriate for a piano. And the inverse is also true, how to take things that are appropriate for a piano and expand them out so that they sound good in an orchestration. So this is one example of how a master does that. And Jerry was a master, you know, definitely top 10 films composers in history, you know, maybe even top 5, you know, his legendary status. Okay, so we've got that eighth note figure. We've got this simple little melody. Right? So there are a lot of this is innocence, right? So he's the whole bit here, the opening is, right? So what is that, those first 3 notes, what are they? F major. Good, Daniel, that's right. So if we were using figured bass, what would we say that's a 1 blank chord? Thank you. 1 6 4, because you got your C as your lowest note. The F is a fourth higher, and the A is a sixth higher from the C. So he's not doing starting with the F, right? He's not doing that, right? He starts with the C, and he goes through the F up to the A. And what's really interesting is you've got C, D, and then back to C here, right? So basically, so how does he ornament that to make a cogent musical thought, right? So what he does is he makes it like a question and an answer kind of a phrase. So you've got right? Da, do, 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 do. Now, the answer. But it's not complete because we're ending on the fifth scale degree, right? To make that complete. If he had ended that on an F, that sounds finished. But he's not finished yet. He's going forward. And so, these things sound rudimentary. Like almost beneath your intelligence. You're all intelligent college and undergraduate and graduate students, right? But this kind of paying attention to detail and these kinds of structures really do translate out to the listener, right? And so, just to present them like that, I think is very helpful, based upon stuff I've heard, right? I'm trying to get you guys to be more concise and to find your small ideas within the things that you've been handing in, and to work with those and know when enough is enough. So he didn't go, he didn't do that, right? That's like so inappropriate. And then you can also think of it as 1, 2, and then here. So you go. So in other words, he's going from C to E to D. And then he's going E to D back to C, right? And then how he fills that in. So if you did this. So what else? Other things can you do? You could reverse the notes. Right? That's so. Or you could do right. Those are some other ideas, ways that you could fill in the space between those tones. Okay, so then the second time through the same bit, and then he ends it on the F here. And then he goes to this next section here, right, where the melody is a parallel sixths, right? Right? I'm sorry. He has a little B natural in there. So the one thing here is he starts to add a chromatic tone on this E flat here. And typically when you have an F an F chord, which you really want to go down to the B flat, right? Because that's the 5 of the 4 chord. But then he goes right to the 5 here. And then again. So he's got this phrase. And then you're not ending, right? I'm sorry. So if I take it now from here, the second time through. Right, so the second time through, he ends, right? So he's got the same kind of structure as the beginning, where the first time it's sort of like a half cadence, and the second time it ends. And then here, a half cadence, and second time it ends. But right when he hits this F chord, at measure 16, the next beat, right? So now he's going to A flat here. So that's like a chromatic mediant. When you move up to either A flat, you move up to the flat 3 or down to the flat 6, or you move up to the major 3 or the major 6. So in other words, if you're in the key of F, if you move to A major as your place or to A flat, that's like a chromatic mediant. So you're in the mediant, the third, and you're changing a pitch. So with this, right, you're going to, there's a C sharp in that chord. There's no C sharp in the key of F. But if you go to the A flat, well, that's the relative major of F minor. So those keys are related. And then if you go from F, right, down to D major, that's a chromatic mediant, and you've got the F sharp, which isn't in that key. But if you go down to D flat, the D flat is the flat 6 chord of F minor, the parallel minor, or the 4 chord of the A flat major, the relative major of F minor. So those are related a certain ways. So that's what he's doing here, and that's an interesting modulation that you hear in film scores all over the place, right? So that's a standard technique used by 90% of all film composers. But it's great because when he's here, right? So it lifts you up and moves you forward. And then he ends it up by going back to the F major. So it's really interesting and powerful. And this brings me to another concept, another point. This sounds simple. But you just heard me going through all these really complex things that he's doing, right? But he's such a gifted composer that he can write the most dissonant, most complex, most, craziest music, and yet he can write something like this, right, that sounds like a child's lullaby. And he's at home in any of those things, because for him, music is about telling stories and acquiring the skills, the tools, the vocabulary and the imagination with which to execute your ideas to achieve your goals, so that the complexity of the music doesn't really matter anymore. It's, am I helping to tell the story? That's what the most important thing is. I read an interesting story recently. So I played you the theme from Chinatown in the first class, probably, and that's considered one of the 20, like one of the top 20 film scores of all time, right? By all the people that rank things, it's an unbelievable score. I just read something where he came in and replaced the original composer, which happens often, and he had 10 days to write the entire score. 10 days. Yeah. That's insane. Okay, any questions on that? Any observations? Yes, Jorge.
Hi, Pete. A question I had, or just kind of like an observation, uh, was like, I really appreciated going through like all the different scores and then like looking at the sheet music. I was like typing this in the chat, but I wanted to make sure we got through the whole piece. But like a really tricky thing I have found like through the scores is like, I mean, you tied it up at the end, but like how sparse the notes are in some ways feels like it's really driven by like the composer's feel more than like an intentional choice to like almost modulate the key. Like I'm sure they're whether it's like subconsciously or intentionally they're choosing to do something like change the key. But like I know when I've been like doing the assignments for our course, I'm like my hands start moving and I'm trying to it feels like we're trying to train our instincts. That's more of like an observation than anything, but it's like trying to like train our instincts in a way to like not overplay, you know?
Right. So you bring up a really interesting point. So I can talk about this from my own personal experience. All right. The more films that I scored, the more I realized that many, many times less notes is better. And so through repetition and doing these things over and over and over again, you train your creative mechanics. I don't know if that's the right word, but I'm going to use that for right now, to make those choices. So, for example, if you're shooting a basketball, right, and you get the ball and your arm is out like this and you shoot it like that, that's like really bad form, right? They want you to have one unit from your body to the end of your hand and get your legs involved and just let the ball shoots itself, but the form has to be right. And you train yourself over and over. The best shooters, Steph Curry probably has spent like thousands and thousands of hours just shooting jump shots, concerning himself only with his form and not with whether the ball goes in or not. Because once he perfects his form, the ball typically goes in, right? And so it's very similar here in that you train yourself from doing these. Like this is much different, than training yourself to take a solo on a jazz tune. It's much different than training yourself to write a piece of concert music. It's much different than training yourself to write a pop song, right? Because film music is part of, it's like being in theater. One of the things I loved, there were a lot of things I didn't love about playing in theater. But one of the things I really loved was being part of a team, right? And so the team is on many levels. When you're in the pit, so I was part of the rhythm section team. But then I was also part of the accompanying team because there was many times in many of the shows I played where I'd be the only one playing with some light orchestration and playing these, or playing figures like that, or playing things like that while there's all sorts of other instruments going around, right? So you're like the continuo almost. But by the same token, you need to keep steady time, but you also need to have the flexibility and the elasticity in your playing technique that when the conductor is 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2, like at the ends of phrases when they're doing slight rallentandos, you need to have your flexibility so that when you're doing those things on the keyboard, all of the eighth notes that you're playing are related to each other, and that takes training. So that's another part of the team you're in. But then if you're in the orchestra, there's also the crew. There's also the follow spot operator. There's also the stage management. There's the dressers. There's the carpenters. There's the electric people. There's the sound people, right? Then there's the actors. There's the stars. And then there's the chorus. Then there's the dancers. Then there's all these subcategories of all the different parts that make up the big team, and they come together to tell a story. And that's what film score. That's what films are. Look at the end credits. See how many people it takes sometimes for some of these films. The end credits, there's like hundreds of people working on this film. Hundreds. And, some of these people don't have anywhere near the importance that you as the composer will have, but they're part of a larger department that does have as much importance as you do, So, you're part of a team, and your objective is to tell the story. And that's a much different assignment. And it's very difficult when you've spent your whole life learning how to play difficult pieces of music, working on soloing over very difficult chord changes, to suddenly switch, and all of a sudden things like that are appropriate. Whereas, that's not. So, okay, let's leave this here.